I remember a man with his jaw blown off by a bomb. A fine-looking chap he was, they said. He lay there with one hand groping at the bandages which covered his whole head and face, gurgling every time he breathed. His tongue was tied forward to prevent him swallowing it. The war had gagged him, smashed him. And other people looked at him and tried to forget what they'd seen. All this I remember while the desirable things of life, like living phantoms, steal quietly into my brain, look wistfully at me, and steal away again.
Even 50 years on, the poet Siegfried Sassoon is still haunted by his experiences in the First World War. He's never been able to get over the trauma of the trenches and is tormented by the guilt of having survived. Told through diaries, letters and poems, this is the story of Sassoon's war and his friendship with two other men who would go on to be immortalised alongside him as war poets: Robert Graves and Wilfred Owen. Together, they will open up the eyes of a nation to the reality of war. July 1914. Sassoon is 28. The son of a wealthy banker, he's living a life of leisure. He's dropped out of Cambridge, but he's passionate about poetry. With no pressure to earn a living, he's beginning to tire of endless hunts, dinners and parties. He's looking for a deeper meaning to life. On the 4th of August 1914, Britain declares war on Germany.
It seemed almost as if I'd been waiting for this thing to happen.
Sassoon is one of the first to enlist. Like most young men across Britain, he can't wait to fight for his country and a glorious cause. He writes the poem Absolution, capturing the excitement in the air.
The anguish of the earth absolves our eyes, till beauty shines in all that we can see. War is our scourge, yet war has made us wise. And fighting for our freedom, we are free.
Not long after he arrives at an officer's training camp, Sassoon meets a kindred spirit.
Sassoon.
Thomas.
Thomas what?
David Thomas.
My new companion had the obvious good looks that go with fair hair and firm features. But it was the radiant integrity of his expression which astonished me. He was as good as gold, and everyone knew it as soon as they knew him. He had arrived at manhood in the nick of time to serve his country in what he naturally assumed to be a just and glorious war. He was a shining epitome of his unembittered generation, which gladly gave itself to the German shells and machine guns.
I'll see you at dinner.
Yeah, look forward to it.
Tommy made all the difference to my life. We defied the boredom of life in the camp, and while the summer went past us, our only fear was that we might be separated when our turn came to go abroad.
Sassoon waits almost a year to be sent to the front. When the call comes, he finds out, to his joy, that he and Tommy will be heading to France together with the 1st Royal Welsh Fusiliers.
Tommy and I were on our way to the 1st Battalion. The real war, the big bullying bogey, had stood up and beckoned us at last. For the first time in our lives, we had crossed the channel. Everything was behind us, and the 1st Battalion was in front of us.
Twist.
By sheer coincidence, in his first week with the 1st Royal Welsh, Sassoon meets another officer given to writing poetry.
I have another card.
Captain Robert Graves.
Yeah, another one.
He's awkward and abrasive around the other men, but he's one of only 5 officers to have survived the disastrous Battle of Lewes.
Twist. Yeah,
Although 9 years younger than Sassoon, he's by far the more experienced soldier.
Twist. Alright, mate, don't worry about it. Twist.
A day or two after I arrived, I noticed the essays of Lionel Johnson lying on the table in the mess. It was the first book I'd seen in France that was neither a military textbook nor a rubbishy novel. I stole a look at the flyleaf, and the name was Siegfried Sassoon. Then I looked around to see who could possibly be called Siegfried Sassoon and bring Lionel Johnson with him to the 1st Battalion. The answer was obvious.
Robert Graves, a young poet, captain of the 3rd Battalion, and very much disliked. An interesting creature, overstrung, self-conscious, a defier of convention.
Sassoon and I have great difficulty in talking about poetry and that sort of thing together, as the other officers of the battalion are terribly curious and suspicious. If I go into his mess and he wants to show me some set of verses, he says, "Afternoon, Graves, have a drink. By the way, I want you to see my latest recipe for rum punch." The trenches are worse than billets for privacy. We're a disgrace to the battalion and we know it. Sassoon had only published a few privately printed pastoral pieces of 1890-ish flavour. I had 1 or 2 drafts in my pocketbook and showed them to him. He frowned and said that war should not be written about in such a realistic way, but in return he showed me some of his own poems. Siegfried had not yet been in the trenches. I told him in my old soldier manner that he would soon change his style.
Sassoon's innocence is soon to be broken. Towards the end of 1915, the Germans use gas for the first time, and British casualties rise to over 500,000. The British plan a huge offensive to wear down the Germans in the Somme area of France. The front line is 20 miles long. The British build trenches, sometimes only 40 yards away from the enemy. The 1st Royal Welsh are sent off to prepare and train for battle nearby. Sassoon, Graves and Tommy are involved in intensive preparations, bringing up supplies and building up the front line. But around them, lives are being lost daily, in numbers never known before. Sassoon has frequent premonitions about losing those close to him. In his poem, The Dugout, he writes about a vision that his beloved Tommy will be one of them.
Why do you lie with your legs ungainly huddled, one arm bent across your sullen, cold, exhausted face? It hurts my heart to watch you deep-shadowed from the candle's guttering gold, and you wonder why I shake you by the shoulder. Drowsy, you mumble, and sigh and turn your head. You are too young to fall asleep forever. And when you sleep, you remind me of the dead.
The day after Sassoon has this premonition, he hears the news he's been dreading.
His face warned me to expect bad news. No news could have been worse. Tommy had been killed. He'd been hit in the throat by a rifle bullet while out with a wiring party, and had died at the dressing station a few hours afterwards.
Graves is the only person Sassoon can reveal his true feelings to.
When I last saw him, he had his notebook in his hand, reading my last poem. And I said goodnight to him in the moonlit trenches. Had I but known.
In the half-clouded moonlight, the parson stood above the graves. We could not hear the solemn words for the noise of a machine gun along the line. And when all was finished, a canister fell a few hundred yards away to burst with a crash. A sack was lowered into a hole in the ground. The sack was Tommy. I knew death then.
Tommy's death totally changes Sassoon's attitude towards the war.
I used to say I couldn't kill anyone in this war. But since they shot Tommy, I would gladly stick a bayonet into a German by daylight. Someone told me a year ago that hate, love, and sorrow were things I'd never known. Things which every poet should know. Now I've known love for Tommy, and grief, and hate has come also in a lust to kill.
Siegfried distinguished himself by taking single-handed a battalion frontage which the Royal Irish Regiment had failed to take the day before. He went over with bombs in daylight, under covering fire, and scared away the occupants. A pointless feat, since instead of signalling for reinforcements, he sat down in the German trench and began reading a book of poems which he had brought with him.
Sassoon's heroic and often eccentric behaviour earns him a nickname, Mad Jack. He wins a military cross for bringing in a wounded lance corporal from a mine crater close to the German lines under heavy fire. The government launched their huge offensive against the Germans in the Battle of the Somme. On the first day, July 1st, 1916, there were 60,000 casualties, a third of them killed. Virtually no ground is gained. It will go on for over 4 months. No one has ever seen slaughter on this scale before. Officers' life expectancy here is 6 weeks.
Sometimes when I see my companions lying asleep, their faces turned to the earth, or rolled in the blankets hidden by the folds, I wonder whether they are alive or dead. For at any hour I may come upon them and find that long silence descended over them. Their faces grey and disfigured. Dark stains of blood soaked through their torn garments. All their hope and merriment snuffed out forever.
On July the 20th, Graves was seriously injured during an attack in a French village. He's taken to the army dressing station. The next morning, Sassoon is informed of his death.
Clearing away the dead, they found me still breathing and put me on an ambulance for the nearest field hospital. The pain of being jolted down the Happy Valley with a shell hole at every 3 or 4 yards of the road woke me up. I remember screaming.
My dear Sassons, I hope you haven't taken the casualty list seriously again. I am as right as rain and hope before many days to be up again basking in the sun. The rumour of
My death was started by the regimental doctor, swearing I couldn't possibly live. But it takes a lot to kill youth and ugliness, however easily youth and beauty fade and die. Eddie tells me you were quite sad about my demise. I hope you didn't avenge me with bombs or do anything rash. Tomorrow my mater and pa will be flooded with condolences about me. Awful nuisance. And my pay and allowances will be awfully difficult to get now. Yours, very affectionately, Robert. By the way, I died on my 21st birthday. I can never grow up now.
In the trenches, the slaughter is relentless and has no end in sight. Sassoon's physical and mental health is beginning to suffer. He shares his daily reality in the poem rearguard.
Groping along the tunnel step by step, he winked his prying torch with patching glare from side to side and sniffed the unwholesome air. Tins, boxes, bottles, shapes too vague to know. A mirror smashed, the mattress from a bed. And he exploring 50 feet below the rosy gloom of battle overhead. Tripping, he grabbed the wall, saw someone lie humped at his feet, half hidden by a rug, and stooped to give the sleeper's arm a tug. "I'm looking for headquarters." No reply. "God blast your neck!" For days he had no sleep. "Get up and guide me through this stinking place." Savage, he kicked a soft, unanswering heap and flashed his beam across the livid face, terribly glaring up, whose eyes yet wore agony dying hard 10 days before, and fists of fingers clutched a blackening wound. Alone he staggered on until he found dawn's ghost that filtered down a shafted stair to the dazed, muttering creatures underground who hear the boom of shells in muffled sound. At last, with sweat of horror in his hair, he climbed through darkness to the twilight air, unloading hell behind him, step by step.
While I lie awake staring at the darkness, nothing seems to matter but a speedy release from the hell that awaits me. There is little tenderness left in me, only bitter resentment. For the soldier is no longer a noble figure, he is merely a writhing insect among this ghastly folly of destruction. The horrors I saw last week are enough to drive any poet off his head.
April 1917. Sassoon's unit is fighting in the Battle of Scarpe when he is hit between the shoulders by a German sniper. He survives and is sent back home to England to convalesce. Despite being a decorated war hero, he makes his disillusionment clear in poems like Suicide in the Trenches.
I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life in empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark and whistled early with the lark. In wintered trenches, cowed and glum, with cramps and lice and lack of rum, he put a bullet through his brain, and no one spoke of him again. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when soldier lads march by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go.
Sassoon is determined to do something concrete to express his rage. Neither his frontline service nor his poetry are enough. He wants to make a public stand.
I am writing you this private letter with the greatest possible regret. I must inform you that it is my intention to refuse to perform any further military duties. I am doing this as a protest against the policy of the government prolonging the war by failing to state their conditions of peace. I have written a statement of my reasons, of which I enclose a copy. I am fully aware of what I am letting myself in for.
And that could be public humiliation by court-martial. But it doesn't stop him from sending his statement to be read in Parliament by a sympathetic MP and being published in the Times.
I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, as I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those that have the power to end it. I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defence and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops and can no longer be party to prolonging those sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust.
Graves is beside himself when he hears the news.
It's an awful thing. Completely mad that he's done. Such rotten luck on you and me and his friends, especially in the regiment. They all think he's mad. And they'd be prepared to hush it up, but I don't think he will let them hush it up. I'm not going to quarrel with assassins. Personally, I think he's quite right in his views, but absolutely wrong in his action.
Graves pleads with the authorities not to take disciplinary action, arguing that Sassoon is actually suffering from shell shock and should be brought in front of a special medical board. Sassoon is not convinced.
We discussed the political situation. I took the line that everyone was mad except ourselves and one or two others, and that no good could come of offering common sense to the insane. What would the 1st Battalion think of him? They would accuse him of ratting, having cold feet, and letting the regiment down. Nobody would follow his example in England or in Germany.
Oh, Robert, whatever will happen to end the war, it's all very well for you to talk about good form and acting like a gentleman. If you had real courage, you wouldn't acquiesce as you do.
July the 20th, the medical board is convened.
Much against my will, I had to appear in the role of a patriot distressed by the mental collapse of a brother in arms, a collapse directly due to his magnificent exploits in the trenches. I mentioned Siegfried's hallucinations of corpses strewn along Piccadilly. The irony of having to argue to these old men that Siegfried was not sane. Though conscious of a betrayal of truth, I acted jesuitically. Being in nearly as bad a state as Siegfried myself, I burst into tears 3 times during my statement.
Are you saying a rotten state of nerves, please?
I prayed that when Siegfried came into the boardroom after me, he would not undo my work by appearing too sane.
You seem more jumping overwrought than I am.
His mental condition is abnormal. His conversation is disconnected.
Graves's plan has worked. Sassoon is sent off to a psychiatric hospital to be cured. Yet far from silencing him, a chance encounter here will produce some of the greatest anti-war poetry in the English language. July 1917, Craig Lockhart Military Psychiatric Hospital, Edinburgh. This is a place where Britain's traumatised officers are sent to recover from shell shock. Siegfried Sassoon has been sent here following his public protest against the war. He spends his days playing golf and exploring the Scottish countryside.
I'm quite all right. It's simply an opportunity for marking time and reading steadily. The Pentland Hills are glorious. I leap on the ridges like a young ram. My fellow patients are 160 more or less dotty officers. Many of them are degenerate looking, some are genuine cases of shell shock.
One patient is a young second lieutenant from Shropshire who's been sent here after a nervous breakdown. He was blown high into the air by a trench mortar and spent several days lying in a hole looking at the remains of a fellow officer.
Down into the mud, penetrating now into my sleeping bag, unthinkably dirty and squalid. Men drowning. An octopus of sucking clay. Everything horribly upset. Smiling corpses. I am never going back to this awful post. Never! Never! Gas! Hideous landscapes, vile noises, foul language and nothing foul. Batter of guns and shatter of flying muscles. Eyeballs shrink tormented back into their brain.
This nervous 24-year-old is called Wilfred Owen. His stammer prevents him from speaking fully about his experience in the trenches, but he is able to express himself through writing. He has been writing poetry since he was 10. Owen also finds comfort in reading the work of one of his favourite writers, Siegfried Sassoon. His poems have recently been published in a collection called The Old Huntsman.
I have just been reading Siegfried Sassoon. and am feeling at a very high pitch of emotion. Nothing like his trench life sketches has ever been written, or ever will be written. Shakespeare reads vapid after these.
To his amazement, Owen discovers his hero is a fellow patient. He writes of his excitement to his mother, Susan.
I have not yet dared to go up to him and parley in a casual way. He is here, you know, because he wrote a letter to the higher command which was too plain spoken. I will send you his book one day and tell you what sort of powwow we've had.
One morning there was a gentle knock on the door of my room, and a young officer entered.
Hello.
Yes?
A favourable first impression was made by the fact that he had under his arm several copies of The Old Huntsman. He had come, he said, hoping that I would be so gracious as to inscribe them for himself and some of his friends.
Reader.
My mother, Susan Owen.
He spoke with a slight stammer, which was no unusual thing in that neurosis-pervaded hospital.
I like the deathbed best. He's young. He hated war. How should he die when cruel old campaigners win safe through? But death replied, I choose him. So he went.
He had a charming, honest smile, and his manners were modest and ingratiating.
Do you write?
Yes.
Poetry?
Yes. Nothing in print yet.
Bring me some.
Oh, no.
No, I insist.
Right. At last I have an event worth a letter. I have beknown myself to Siegfried Sassoon. The sun blazed into his room, making his purple dressing suit of a brilliance almost matching my sonnet. He is very tall and stately,
with a fine, firm, chiselled, how's that, head. Ordinary short brown hair. The general expression of his face is one of boredom.
A word from Sassoon, though he is not a cheery dog himself, makes me cut capers of pleasure.
So the last thing he said was, sweat your guts out. Eh, says I?
Sweat your guts out writing poetry. You'll have had enough of Sassoon. Just one more tidbit. The man is tall and noble looking. He himself is 30, looks under 25. Cheero, I'm well enough by day and generally so by night. A better mode of life than this present I could not practically manage.
I have an uncomfortable suspicion that I was a bit slow in recognising the exceptional quality of his poetic gift. Manuscript poems can be deceptive when handed to one like school exercises to be blue-penciled, especially when one has played 36 holes of golf and consumed a stodgy hospital dinner. I was sometimes a little severe on what he showed me, censoring the over-luscious writing in his immature pieces.
Just as Graves had done for him 2 years earlier, Sassoon toughens up Owen's writing style.
There was almost an embarrassing sweetness in the sentiment of some of his work, though it showed skill in a rich and melodious combination of words. My only claimable influence was that I stimulated him towards writing with compassionate and challenging realism.
Tonight, Sassoon called me into him. There are not a few whom I like, say, as a poet only, as an actor only, as a table companion only, as a trenchmate only, as a servant only, as a statue only, as a marble idol only. Sassoon I like equally as a man, as a friend, as a poet. He wrote a piece which is the most exquisitely painful war poem of any language or time. I don't tell him so, or that I'm not worthy to light his pipe. I simply sit tight and tell him where I think he goes wrong.
In September 1917, Owen writes the first draft of a poem he calls Dead Youth.
No. Wailing shells.
What about the title? Dead Youth.
Anthem for Dead Youth.
Anthem for Dead Youth.
Yes. Anthem.
Yes.
Yes?
Sassoon supplied the title Anthem. Just what I meant it to be.
It was not until sometime in October, when he brought me his superbly constructed sonnet, that it dawned on me that my little friend was much more than the promising minor poet I had hitherto adjudged him to be. I knew I was in the presence of greatness.
It's still this part here. Only the solemn anger of our guns.
Only the solemn anger of our guns. Only the monstrous.
Only the monstrous anger of the guns.
What's the title?
Anthem for Dead Youth.
I'm not sure. Anthem for Doomed Youth.
Anthem for Doomed Youth. Yes, I like that. Anthem for Doomed Youth. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers, the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk, the drawing down of blinds.
During these 3 months in Craiglockhart, Owen writes 20 poems, almost half of his entire work.
I cannot insist too strongly that our relationship was ideal. There was never a false vibration. We were brother poets, and our differences in character were complementary aids to one another. The clue to his poetic genius was sympathy, not only in his outlook upon humanity, but in all his actions and responses towards individuals.
Owen, encouraged by Sassoon, plans to try get his first book of poems published. He later writes the preface.
This book is not about heroes. English poetry is not yet fit to speak of them, nor is it about deeds or lands, nor anything about glory, honour, might, majesty, dominion, or power, except war. Above all, I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war, and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity.
Sassoon and Owen have become inseparable, but this period is about to come to an abrupt end.
Saturday, 29th of October, 1917. My own dearest mother. I hear this morning that I am to be boarded next Tuesday and sent away. I am rather upset about it, especially as I am so happy with Sassoon. Spent all day with him yesterday. Breakfast, lunch, tea and dinner.
But Owen feels it's his duty as a poet to return to the front and record the suffering and courage of his fellow soldiers. Sassoon has left, not knowing when he will see Owen again. The war is about to reach its 4th year, and Sassoon is still stuck in Craig Lockhart Psychiatric Hospital. His soulmate and fellow poet, Owen, is at home in Shrewsbury, waiting for his call to the front.
Know that since mid-September, when you still regarded me as a tiresome little knocker on your door, I held you as Keats, plus Christ, plus Elijah, plus my colonel, plus my father confessor. What's that mathematically? In effect, it is this: that I love you, dispassionately, so much. So very much, dear fellow, that the blasting little smile you wear on reading this can't hurt me in the least. You have fixed my life, however short. You did not light me. I was always a mad comet. But you have fixed me. I spun round you a satellite for a month. But I shall swing out soon. A dark star, in the orbit where you will blaze.
Sassoon feels increasingly torn between leaving Owen and others to fight on and his own anti-war stance.
At Craig Lockhart, there was always a suppressed awareness which reminded me that I was shortening the war for myself every week that I remained there. Some inward monitor became uncomfortably candid and remarked, "This heroic gesture of yours is extremely convenient for you, isn't it? Doesn't it look rather like dodging the Kaiser's well-aimed projectiles? 12 weeks ago, you may have been a man with a message, but unless you can prove to yourself that your protest is still effective, you are here under false pretenses."
My position here is nearly unbearable, and the feeling of isolation makes me feel rotten. I will go back to France if they will send me. I would rather be anywhere than here.
May 1918. Sassoon finally returns to France. He answers an urgent call for British reinforcements. The Germans look set to break the Allied line. They have just launched a ferocious spring offensive, advancing 40 miles into Allied territory within the space of a week. Despite being made a company commander, Sassoon is as reckless as ever. Almost immediately he is shot again, this time in the head by friendly fire, after one of his own snipers mistakes him for a German.
I'd be dead if I'd moved my head an inch to the right before that bullet whizzed down. I felt and believed that I was as good as dead. While blood poured from my head, I was intensely aware of everything around me. The clear sky, the early glow of sunrise on the horrified face of the corporal who knelt beside me.
Whilst the war is over for Sassoon, Owen decides to return to active service in France. He rejects an offer of indefinite home leave. Feeling it is his duty to take Sassoon's place, he writes some of his most subversive and visceral poems. His most famous poem will come to define the First World War. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for your country.
Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's, sick of sin. If you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, he would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory. The old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patriam mori.
It's now September, and the British counter-offensive is working. The Germans are being driven from all the ground taken in the spring. For the first time, the Allies can see victory, but at a cost. In his letters home from the front, Owen puts on a brave face.
Dearest mother, I have been in action for some days. I lost all my earthly faculties, fought like an angel, and captured a German machine gun and scores of prisoners. I have been recommended for the Military Cross and have recommended every single NCO who was with me. My nerves are in perfect order. I came out in order to help these boys, directly by leading them as well as an officer can.
Owen saves his true feelings for Sassoon.
The battalion had a sheer time last week. I can find no better epithet, because I cannot say I suffered anything, having let my brain
grow dull. It is a strange truth that your counterattack frightened me much more than the real one, though the boy by my side, shot through the head, lay on top of me, soaking my shoulder for half an hour. I shall feel again as soon as I dare, but now I must not.
October 31st, 1918. Owen writes to his mother from a farmhouse cellar where he and his men are taking refuge.
Dearest mother, so thick is the smoke in this cellar that I can hardly see by a candle 12 inches away. And so thick are the inmates that I can hardly write for pokes, nudges and jolts. It is a great life. I am more oblivious than, alas, yourself, dear mother, of the ghastly glimmering of the guns outside and the hollow crashing of the shells. There is no danger down here. Or, if any, it will be well over before you read these lines. I hope you're as warm as I am, as serene in your room as I am here, and that you think of me as I think of you, always.
On November the 11th, 1918, the Great War ends. Germany, bereft of manpower and supplies, and faced with imminent invasion, signs an armistice agreement with the Allies. In Shrewsbury, as the armistice bells ring, Susan Owen gets a telegram. Her son was one of the last casualties of German machine guns, just a week earlier, on November the 4th.
After the armistice, I waited to hear from him, not daring to ask myself during those weeks of lively distraction why no letter arrived. Several months elapsed before I was told about his death. I've never been able to accept that disappearance philosophically. A blank, miserable sense of deprivation has dulled my mind whenever I've thought of him. And even now, it has needed an effort of will to describe our friendship. Recognition of his poetry has steadily increased. But the chasm in my private existence remains.